Welcome back, Cold War 5 listeners. My name is Mike Dupre. I'm the host of this episode with Professor of Social Science Michael G. Kort. Dr. Kort's a member of the National Association of Scholars. He's a distinguished author on a number of topics related broadly to the Cold War and Russian history, including the Vietnam War Reexamined, the Columbia Guide to Hiroshima and the Bomb, the Columbia Guide to the Cold War, Modernization and Revolution in China, and probably most applicable to our conversation today, the Soviet Colossus, History and Aftermath, a reexamination of Russian history from the fall of the tsarist regime to most recently the state capitalist economy in which we engage with under Vladimir Putin. I think, given Russia's expansionist efforts of late, increasing influence on the global stage, and the controversies that kind of accompany that, I think this is a very timely book, and it's now in its 8th edition. So it's really, as we can see in the chapters, we can see this evolution of not only Russia but its relationship with America, and I think that's something very profound with it. I think further proving this topic is not necessarily isolated to the past. But as always, as we talk about, the views expressed on Cold War V are that of the guest or myself, and by no means represent the views of Boston University, the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies, or any of our related affiliates. But with that being said, Dr. Kort, thanks for joining me today. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to kind of position us now in the topic of what today's conversation would be, which is essentially the end of history, the age of tomorrow, the title of the episode. So if we're positioning ourselves in the 1990s, we're kind of jumping ahead from the true start of the Cold War, more to its explosive conclusion. But for those who aren't necessarily historians out there, to understand the context of the title, and for those maybe joining us from other disciplines, The End of History is an excerpt from political theorist Francis Fukuyama's thesis, The End of History and the Last of Man, where it provides, again, this was originally published in 1992, an argument for the liberalization of the world order as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Liberalism in the sense of democracy, freedom, free markets was going to expand, and it was essentially going to end all of the wrongs and atrocities we had seen elsewhere around the world, to summarize Fukuyama's argument. And it's this grand ascendancy to Western liberalism. I think, in his words, humanity has reached not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as a final form of human government. His historical perspective, I think, as you've mentioned in the past, has a very linear approach to it, and similar to maybe Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, bold claims, as you've said, but I'm interested to hear your opinions on Fukuyama's, determination of what the future holds.
Well, when he wrote this, I was pretty skeptical of it. At about the same time, Samuel Huntington came out with his view of things, in which he talked about the future being more what he called the clash of civilizations, looking at the world in a very broad context, and at what he called different civilizations: Slavic civilization, Western civilization, Sinic, Chinese civilization, Japan, and others. And Fukuyama, you're right, he drew heavily from Hegel and from Marx, and saw this almost inevitable development. What it clearly overlooked was events. Events, and you've actually noted this as well in some of the things he gave to me. Events change things, and they are unpredictable. And there was enormous optimism back then. I mean, one of the things that for people today, especially younger people, that might be hard to imagine, is that back in the late 80s and into the early 1990s, certainly, you woke up every morning, you couldn't wait for the news because it was so good. And things seemed to be happening very, very quickly. I was very skeptical of it because it seemed to me that you have to look more broadly at things than he did. You have to look at things that are unpredictable. And even though Russia seemed to be changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russia seemed to be changing. And there seemed to be some hope that Russia certainly was going to evolve into a more democratic country and be. And when you look at Russia, you say Russia is European but not Western, and that Russia would now become more Western. There were certainly large parts of the world where that wasn't happening. It certainly wasn't happening in the People's Republic of China, where you had this effort to promote democracy among young people that ended in Tiananmen Square and ended in the massacre of Tiananmen Square. So China wasn't going in that direction. In many other parts of the world, they weren't. So I was very skeptical at the time. I thought Huntington made a lot more sense. When you look at Huntington's writings in the 1990s, obviously he makes some bold predictions. He gets some of them wrong. Predictions are dangerous. But I think he much more accurately predicted what the world was coming to and has gone to since then than Fukuyama. Basically, I think Fukuyama just got it dreadfully wrong. And that optimism, which, again, so many people shared, at least in terms of Russia, as we know, hasn't happened.
Definitely. I think I guess off that point tangentially, there was this belief, as you had hinted at, that Russia is going to become democratic. We're going to bring them into our sphere of influence, and we're going to end essentially the storied atrocities that they had committed, under Stalin and whatnot. It obviously hasn't happened, and we're now back to the authoritarianism that we saw in the 20th century. And I'm curious, as a Soviet historian and as a Russian historian by and large, was, as you had mentioned, it was almost predestined that they would come back to this authoritarian trend that they had succumbed to, essentially. It's a part of their identity. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that, too, that Russian identity that is so ingrained with stoicism and, authoritarianism.
There are a lot of things. I mean, it's important to understand when you look at Russian history, there certainly is this long authoritarian tradition going back to centuries. I mean, Russia was cut off from the West by the Mongol invasion back in the 13th century. It missed the Renaissance. It missed the Enlightenment, really, in many ways. It was cut off from the West. Beginning in the mid-19th century, Western influence began to penetrate Russia, and you had some competition within Russia, certainly. There were many Russians who looked back, how can Russia improve itself? And you had people, they were called Slavophiles, that said, we've got to go back to Russia's tradition. They rejected the West. They rejected it in many different ways. And Putin's most recent comments really reflect that way of thinking, although the Slavophiles had themselves many different ways of looking at what should be done, and some were very authoritarian and others were not. And I wrote about this in the Soviet Colossus, especially after the abolition of serfdom in 1861. You have this expansion of Western influence, and it continued through the golden age of Russian literature, which begins really in the 1830s, and what's known as the Silver Age of Russian culture, which begins in the 1890s. And you certainly had people who thought we would call Western liberals, and they were well organized, and they certainly expressed themselves. In the beginning, after the 1905 revolution, you actually had a parliament, and so you had some limits on the autocracy. And so Russia seemed to be moving in that direction. Then came World War I, the collapse of the regime, the Bolshevik Revolution, and that put an end to it. And that drove Russia back, as many people would say, and as I think too, back to the old Russian tradition of authoritarianism. And Bolshevism and very much grew out of that authoritarian tradition, even though the Bolsheviks would have denied that completely. In the process, when you had 70 years of this, it utterly destroyed what we call civil society, that is, all the institutions independent of the of the state. Citizens having their own political parties, having their own independent groups in many, many different ways, which is really in many ways the basis of Western democracy and Western market capitalism. This was totally destroyed. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the optimism that existed, what I think, we had seen things begin to get better under Gorbachev and his reforms. And even though he failed and the Soviet Union collapsed, the hope was that this would continue under Yeltsin. But what really seems to have happened is that the institutions that are the basis of what we call Western liberal society had been so totally destroyed. And what was really left in an organized force was the secret police, the KGB, under a different name. And as something that had begun to develop really in the 1980s, organized crime. And that's what was left. And then you had all these difficulties in the 1990s, and then ultimately the return to what we call the Russian tradition, beginning with Vladimir Putin. And there's, could things have gone differently even then? It's possible. I mean, Putin was appointed after, Yeltsin got rid of one prime minister after another. Had somebody else been appointed, it could have developed somewhat differently, and maybe not as bad as what we've got today. This really was almost the worst of all possible options.
Certainly. I think it's a very valid point to make, especially about the 1990s. I mean, not just in Russia, but around the world was such a transitional period in the turn of the century, this going away with a lot of the ills that had occurred. Transitioning a little bit over now to what Robert Kagan has said and what he calls ideology's rude return. He's notoriously an advocate, just so listeners know his stance, he's notoriously an advocate for American, more broadly, liberal interventionism. And he claims in this article that the developments of great power atrocities are an unanticipated shift. You're a historian by craft. Do you agree with that notion, or does your craft tell you otherwise? Are there any shifts really unanticipated in the realm of ideology that you think history can lend?
Well, what Kagan says is we've returned to autocracy. They believe in that. That's their ideology. I don't think he's wrong. I think in terms of what was unanticipated in the return to autocracy, again, was the optimism about Russia that this wasn't going to happen. In terms, and just to go again, you have to ask, where do these beliefs come from? And I think he could go a little deeper and, again, look at what Samuel Huntington said, that these beliefs, grow out of, they're deep, and they're deep because they're civilizational. You have a long tradition of, well, as Putin would have put it, we had first the Tsar, then we had communism, all a strong, centralized, autocratic state. And now, as he put it, we have the president, meaning, of course, himself. But what he's saying here is this is the Russian way, and this is what made Russia great. And, Russia became powerful under the Tsars. In other words, it's civilizational. You'll get the same thing, pretty much, if you look at what they're saying in the People's Republic of China. It's basically the same outlook. So, and in this case, it was very clear that they were not going to stray from this. This was not, it can't be unexpected because, people, again, watched Tiananmen Square. We were all excited. It it was unbelievable. I mean, again, you younger folks, you missed something. You really, really missed something. And then it ended in this horror that that everybody knows about. But yeah, there was this optimism, but I just think that aside from Russia to have been very optimistic about what was going on was misplaced. There are a lot of things, when you look at China, myths, optimism about China. I just want to talk about one because you see it a lot today anyhow, and it's the myth of the China market. That when China opens up, we'll be able to sell to them, and that'll be great. And that's what the Brits were thinking, the British back in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. Oh, we can sell them all our stuff. Turns out the Chinese didn't want any of it until the British found opium. But aside from that, they had no use for British products. Well, the interesting thing is, once the reforms under Deng Xiaoping began and China moved away essentially from socialism and dismantled its socialist economy and replaced it with what we call a state capitalist economy, there were two elements of optimism that were badly misplaced. And one is that if you go to a type of capitalist economy, i.e. a state capitalist economy, somehow that leads you to democracy. No, it doesn't. Authoritarian regimes can have a market economy of sorts and maintain political control, and that's a lesson we see very clearly from China in the last, since the late 1970s. And the other was the China market. Oh, they're going to open up and buy our stuff. And I can remember there was one diplomat, I think he was British, who said, that's not going to happen. What they are going to do is learn how to, they're going to keep our goods out, which they did. They're going to learn how to produce our stuff, and then they're going to sell it all to us. And that was the basis of the special economic zones, and that's what's happened, and that's why so much is manufactured in China. And we let it happen because the goods were cheaper. But there's an old economic saying, you get what you pay for. And these bargains came at a price, and it was the undermining of the American capitalist economy. And one of the interesting ironies about that, again, I wasn't a prophet or anything, but I saw these things happening by the 1980s. And one of the interesting things is among the first people to write about this, who made me aware of it, of all things, were American Marxists, because they thought like them.
Interesting.
And they saw exactly what was going on, and they hit it right on the button.
Certainly. One of the things I think that's something that Fukuyama didn't necessarily take into consideration too was the way in which people come to the free market and maybe economic prosperity. I think that's something that OPEC right now is having an interesting time dealing with, especially with the United States. It's this idea that the United States isn't the guarantor of a great economy anymore, and it doesn't have to be, because there's this authoritarian regime in the East that happens to be able to do the same thing. Obviously there's neglections of climate and there's neglections of other labor laws and things, but it's an interesting dynamic to be made in this century that liberalism and the free market isn't isolated to the West. And I think that's an interesting transitioning point into what this international relationship is like. If civilizations, as Huntington mentions, are dynamic, they're going to rise, they're going to fall, they're going to divide, merge.
Right.
But as a student of historian, as he mentions, when a civilization disappears, he calls it buried in the sand of time. It's never actually truly gone. And I think, as you've poignantly pointed out, is Russia may have tried something, but that doesn't mean Russia, the bear as we know it, is gone. And I think the economic modernization, the social change that we might see in the rest of the world, we can't. Maybe we would be failing ourselves to think that is easily achievable in those places. And with that, maybe what are some lessons we can take from the 20th century very broadly in our dealings with people who don't necessarily think the way in which we think?
Yeah, one of the things about Western civilization, it is Western civilization and only Western civilization that created the idea of individual liberty, that created the idea that the state exists for the people and not the other way around, that basically created the idea of freedom. And freedom and individual liberty and all that goes with it developed over many, many centuries. You trace it all the way back to ancient times to its roots, but it developed and then very slowly, and then it practically disappeared, but it was always somehow there. And then from after the 15th century, it gradually became stronger and gradually took deeper root. The assumption in the West then was that this applies to everyone, because I'm assuming that you think, and I'm assuming that most of the people listening to this, who listen to this broadcast, think that it's better to live in a free society than in an unfree society. And there's a reason that for centuries, millions and millions of people have tried to get into the United States, because it's a better place to live. And when Europe was still run by monarchies and was autocratic, the people wanted to get out of there, and they wanted to come here, and they knew what they were doing, and they knew it was better. It wasn't perfect, all kinds of problems, but it was just a lot better than any place else. So the assumption is that the whole world wants this, but the trouble is that certainly the elites all over in other, whether you're talking about China or you're talking about Russia or you're talking about other civilizations, don't see it that way. And one of the things that Putin has said over and over again, and he said it right at the beginning actually, or that Xi Jinping now repeats over and over again, is that we don't accept your values. And one of the things you may remember from my courses, when unfortunately you weren't in that semester, you're in the second semester. But when we do the China unit, and we're using the book Modernization, Revolution in China, which I wrote with two CGS colleagues. One of the things I have my students read is something called Document Number 9. And document number 9 is a point-by-point rejection of everything that we believe in the West. And they don't miss a thing. And this was issued right around the time that Xi Jinping came into office. And what they're saying is, you're the West, we don't like what you do, it doesn't apply to China, and we're not going to adopt it. And these ideas, you hear it from them. You hear it from Islamic fundamentalists who say the same thing, go to Iran, go to other places, and they point right at this. And they say, you think it's so great, we think it's awful. And I don't agree with them, but the thing that people who believe in these ideas have to realize is that they are going to be rejected in many places. Now, the great optimism, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, right up until the beginning of World War I, there was somebody who was very, very close to Mikhail Gorbachev. His name is Yakovlev, and he's in many ways called the father of perestroika. And he wrote a book, and in that book he said, our country hit its peak right before the war, the World War I. These ideas had penetrated. They were influenced things. You no longer had an absolute autocracy. It was too powerful, unfortunately. But you had a parliament. You had limits. You had a broad educational system. It could have changed. But as Kaplan points out, and as you've pointed out, events get in the way. I mean, just for example, and you can't ever know, but in the Great War, in the Persian attempt in the 5th century BC to conquer Greece, there were a couple of key battles. The most famous, especially in Boston, is Marathon. If the Greeks had lost, that would have been the end of the idea of democracy and of individual liberty and all the rest, and we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. Events can change everything, and here you're talking just about battles. The victory at Marathon, then 10 years later, the victory at Salamis, the great naval victory. This drove the Persians out, and democracy was very fragile, and that's the other thing to remember. It is fragile, and it can easily be destroyed.
One of the people I'd like to bring into this conversation, fundamentally his ideas might have some holes in it, is John Mearsheimer, as we've discussed before the recording.
Yeah, sure.
But I think one of the interesting points he has about his offensive realism is that survival is the primary goal of every great power. And right now, it feels like at times we're living in I imagine in the 20th century as well, it's this irreducibility of fear in our world, and this idea that it's a ideological battle at its core, or maybe even economic, military, whatever it may be. If there are any hesitations we face in our international, are there any hesitations we face in our international dealings because of this? And is our inadequacy to react maybe on some of these issues because of our fear, or is it because we're maybe not sure how to interact with someone who doesn't necessarily play by the same rules and principles that we might play by?
I mean, what Mearsheimer is saying, and I certainly think there's some validity to it, is or a lot of validity to it in this case, is that the Russian regime under Putin feels threatened, and it feels threatened because as a great power, we are intruding into their space. To some extent, that is accurate. There are some problems, though, that one has to add with that, and that is that the thing that worries Putin most of all, and we've gone back and forth about this a little before this broadcast, is that what he really fears is democracy, which people believe in Russia. It's not like no one believes in this. Some proof, since the Ukrainian thing started, the Ukrainian invasion, about 1 million people, young people, educated people, have fled Russia. And they fled Russia because they want no part of this, and because they now fear that the political system really has become totally autocratic, to which some of them, and one in particular that interests me was a diplomat, a guy who worked, he's about in his 40s, I guess. He was a diplomat for 20 years, pretty high up in the foreign ministry. And he actually wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, which I think you now have a subscription to. And it was a couple of issues ago, but he calls Russia a fascist state. And I think, and this is a Russian patriot speaking, okay? And he has become demoralized. He fled the country. So one of the things, I think the idea of promoting democracy is a good thing. I do think democracies are much less likely to go to war with each other. I do think if you had more democracies, you'd have a much more peaceful world. And I think the other thing that one has to recognize about Russia today that Mearsheimer ignores is that Putin is an aggressor. He has launched a war against Ukraine, denying the Ukrainian identity of the people, something that he has no business doing because it's absolutely false. The Ukrainians do see themselves with a separate identity. They have a different language. They've had different influences. Yes, way back when they were all the same people, but that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And a lot of groups have broken off since then, from each other. And the other thing is and this is one of the things we did talk about in my class, and I begin with it, which is what happens when you try to appease aggressors. And to quote Winston Churchill, in the appeasement of Munich in 1938, they chose dishonor to war, and they will get war. And of course, Winston Churchill was right. And I think he got it better than Mersheimer did. Not that Winston Churchill didn't look at the world in terms of realism, because in many ways he did. But he understood clearly at the time that you can't appease aggression, and that the idea of promoting democracy to countries that want it is something that democracies have to do. And now, what this has brought us to, and certainly a lot of people are worried about this, is that Putin's finger is on the nuclear trigger. And who knows what's going to happen. This is very, very dangerous. Again, going back to dealing with the Soviet Union, the policy of containment that I talked about a lot in my course, the idea is you got to avoid appeasement and you have to avoid war. We are avoiding appeasement in Ukraine. Our problem is how to avoid a nuclear confrontation. And to be quite frank, I just don't know exactly how we're supposed to handle that.
Yeah. I think one of the things or two of the points you mentioned, democracy where democracy is wanted, and that the peace that brings, and the peace that it brings to a region. One of the interesting things that you've written extensively on is Vietnam, and you've re-examined that. In hindsight of a lot of the things we've learned, you have a lived experience through this era of both economic prosperity post-Vietnam. I'm curious, what lessons can the United States learn from Vietnam that they might not necessarily be familiar with, or maybe, in your own interpretation, how could that have shaped us?
Again, when you, a lot of the criticism over the American attempt to save South Vietnam from communism is that South Vietnam at the time was not democratic, which it wasn't. No one in Vietnam, certainly none of the leaders who had any influence, were democratic. The communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh, who were trying to take over all of Vietnam, and it's important to understand, one of the reasons they were so strong is from day one they always had help from outside. Ho Chi Minh in his early career was an agent of the Comintern. In other words, he worked for Joseph Stalin. That's how his career began, and he remained a Stalinist all of his life. Now, in Vietnam, historically, Vietnam has also domestically a long authoritarian tradition, but the southern part of Vietnam was different from the north historically, and it was much more open to outside influences. And this is something that people don't know, and what they don't know is that for a period of about 200 years, they were de facto two Vietnamese states, one in the north and one in the south, divided, perhaps coincidentally, at about the 17th parallel, almost exactly at the 17th parallel. And what the communist forces did in Vietnam was to attempt to wipe out all other nationalist groups, and they were always doing this. And then that then continues, into the post-1954 time when you have a North Vietnam that's a communist Stalinist state, and a southern Vietnam that was certainly authoritarian, but was potentially open to other influences. And back at that time, there was a concern that the further expansion of communism, again into Vietnam, could set off what we call domino effect, where other countries would then fall to communism. And so the United States stepped in. The real problem, in my view, was not that we were backing in a regime that had its problems, i.e., if you go back to 1947, you have the exact same thing in Greece. It wasn't a democratic government that we defended either, but it was one that was threatened by communism, and had Greece fallen to communism, it would have really weakened the West. But what was wrong was the way we fought the war. We fought it basically without a strategy. We fought it basically except to prevent the other side from winning. We limited what we allowed our military to do. We did not allow our military to go into Laos and Cambodia, which had essentially, in parts of those two areas, the crucial parts bordering on Vietnam, had been taken over by North Vietnam anyhow. You can't win a war that way if you give the enemy these kind of enormous advantages. We carried out bombing, but we didn't bomb the areas that should have been bombed first, i.e. the parts of North Vietnam that allowed it to carry on the war. Instead, we bombed the areas much further south that didn't affect their war effort. We put all kinds of limits on what our pilots could do and lost many pilots because of that. And then the war dragged on, and Americans began to get frustrated with it. But the problem wasn't that there was something wrong with South Vietnam. There are plenty of non-democratic societies in the world. The problem was the way we fought the war. And we fought the war in a way that gave them every advantage possible, enabled them to continue the war. And eventually, and one of the troubles with a democracy is, as George Marshall once said, a democracy can't fight a 7 years war, meaning that in a democracy, people eventually will react against it if it just goes on and on and on. And in democracy, people have an influence. It's not like a dictatorship, which is just like what Putin's doing now, just throwing people into it and losing enormous numbers. You can't do that in a democracy. You have to protect your soldiers, and you have to make an effort, the maximum effort, to bring them all back home. And if you don't do that, you're going to lose support. And eventually, enough people in the United States, never a majority, came to oppose the war. But in a democracy, when a significant part of the population doesn't support the war, even though it's not a majority, it undermines the war effort.
One of the things that obviously didn't occur, and no nuclear weapons were deployed to Vietnam, but they were on board aircraft carriers and stockpiled within the region, and those numbers had increased basically until mid-1967. And, subconsciously, I'm sure it played a role in that effort. The fact that you indirectly have two global powers with nuclear capabilities on either side of this war. And I guess to end our discussion, circling back to Fukuyama's central hope, the 1990s produced a temporary feeling of ideological hope. But in a world where, we now have weapons of mass destruction, a society and a political divisiveness that maybe we haven't seen domestically in 100 years, can there be a winner of great power struggle in an age of nuclear weaponry?
Not if it comes to nuclear war. Obviously, it can't. What we have to do, and somehow we've got to bring this fighting to an end. This war's now gone on for a year. A lot of people have written about this. I just don't know what arrangement would be satisfactory to the Russians that would also be satisfactory to the West in terms of not being appeasement. The great concern is that, and a lot of people have raised this, is, that they could start using the Russians' tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But I tell you, in the end, I just don't know what terms we should be looking for. I'll say this: I don't think you're going to get certainly a total withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. I know the Ukrainians are unwilling to accept that. I do think if any arrangement can be made, it's going to be made at the price of some Ukrainian territory. How much and all that other stuff, I just don't know. And anything I say will be wrong anyhow, so
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Predictions are always risky, but thank you for your time today, Dr. Kort. It's always a pleasure talking with you. So
Thank you,
appreciate you
Michael.
coming
It's
on.
a pleasure. Thank you a lot.
Baby, you give me ice and fire. You're giving me wings.